This relentless back and forth trade war between the U.S. and China.
A 34% tax on imports from China.
Retaliatory tariffs of 84%.
China is now ratcheting up its tariffs on American goods to 125%.
What underpins it is this broad and vague accusation from Donald Trump that China is cheating.
China, first row. China, 67%. That's tariffs charged to the USA, including currency manipulation and trade barriers.
Now, let's set aside the fact that Trump's administration took none of those things into account when arriving at that 67% number. And we've already done a deep dive into that faulty math. But he keeps mentioning this specific allegation about currency manipulation.
They're manipulating their currency today.
And this is an interesting claim for two reasons. One, because this actually goes way back to Trump's first term in office.
The Trump administration officially named China a currency manipulator.
And like many of Trump's accusations, there is truth somewhere in there. But he's also leaving out an awful lot. If there's just one graph I could show you that illustrates what Trump finds so threatening about China, it would probably be this one. China's annual exports in US dollars according to the World Bank. You see this upward trend in the mid-90s? How that turns into meteoric growth in the early 2000s? And maybe, more importantly, let's superimpose US exports on top. It was about 10 years ago, after many decades of US trade dominance, China didn't just catch up, but shot past America. No other country sells more goods and services to the world than China. And the US is its top customer.
Donald Trump believes that the US trade deficit is a source of national emasculation.
That China sells more to the US than the US sells to China, Trump cites as proof that something unfair is going on. And so enter this idea that China has rigged the game, that it manipulates the very money it spends, deliberately and artificially weakening the value of the yuan against the US dollar, because when you have a weaker yuan, exports become irresistible because Americans can buy more with less. And Trump believes that might explain why the US trade deficit with China was almost $300 billion last year.
They've really taken advantage of our country for a long period of time. They've ripped us off beyond anybody.
So let me explain how that would work, and then we can dive into whether any of it is actually happening.
So typically what happens is when a currency weakens, it means that your goods are cheaper in the rest of the world.
Yes, so let's say the cost right now of $1 US is about 7.3 yuan, which it is. That means if I'm an American and I'm importing something that costs 7,300 yuan, my cost is 1,000 US dollars. Now, if China were to somehow artificially depreciate its currency, making the exchange rate something more like 8 yuan per US dollar, that Chinese product becomes cheaper to import because it's now only costing me $912.50 to bring in. Multiply those kinds of savings across millions of products, and you can see why this might give China a real international advantage. Flood the market with cheaper goods, crush competing industries who can't match your rates, and congratulations, you're one step closer to winning the global manufacturing race. And here's a bonus. If your goods are hit with tariffs, making them more expensive to buy, then a weaker currency can go some distance in offsetting that by making your goods cheaper. But this is just basic economics. What gets talked about a bit less is that a weaker yuan also has the effect of stifling American imports into China. Because now, if I'm some guy in Beijing and the Chinese yuan just got weaker, it's costing me more of my hard-earned money to buy that American Harley Davidson. So maybe I'll shop the domestic brands and opt for a CF Moto 1250 TRG instead. And if that scenario sounds an awful lot like what the US is trying to accomplish with tariffs, making foreign goods more expensive to encourage domestic production, yeah, they're similar. By weakening its currency in our hypothetical scenario, China just achieved two goals at once. Its goods became more attractive to foreign buyers and to local consumers. Now, I'll admit, this is a real simplification. And in reality, a weak currency creates problems too. But this is all just to make a point that if the backbone of your economy, the thing that is singularly responsible for your global economic ascent, is a grand plan to become the world's factory floor, then currency manipulation might be a pretty useful tool in the toolbox, right? But how do you actually do it? It's hard to compare China's yuan, or the renminbi, as they also call it, to the dollar. We know the value of a dollar is always changing, right? Kind of like stocks, because anyone can buy or sell dollars freely, which raises or lowers the price. When it comes to the renminbi, it's not quite like that.
It would be wrong to think of the renminbi as an entirely market-driven currency. The value of the renminbi against the dollar, against any currency, is very carefully monitored and very carefully controlled by the Chinese Central Bank, the People's Bank of China.
Yes, China's central bank simply sets the going rate. You see this column here? These are target exchange rates. Every day, China simply decides what it shall be, and the actual exchange rate ends up being pretty close to that. Here we can see 7.21 renminbi for $1 US. But maybe you're asking, how do you just speak a number to the universe and have everything fall in line exactly as you ordain? Well, it helps to have a ton of purchasing power.
For example, if your current currency starts to strengthen against the US dollar, what you would do is you would then purchase US dollars and sell your own currency.
China hoards money. Its foreign exchange reserves right now total around 3 trillion US dollars, give or take a couple hundred billion, biggest such reserve in the world. So when China buys and sells money, it does so at scale. And like you just heard, it can do this in a way that directly affects the exchange rate between American and Chinese currency. And what's more, it doesn't let the outside world do the same with its currency.
The Chinese banking system is entirely state-owned.
It's not easy to move money into or out of China. And in that way, the private market can't swamp what the central bank is trying to do.
This is what economists call capital control, and I'll give you an example. So say you're a Chinese billionaire and you'd like to splash that money around, maybe buy a property in California. So you'd like to sell your renminbi for US dollars. Problem is, you're a Chinese citizen, and by law, you're only allowed to buy 50,000 US dollars a year. That's not enough for a nice house. But the even bigger problem.
What's critically important about those restrictions, those capital restrictions, is that you can't use the $50,000 limit to buy apartments abroad or to buy assets.
Yeah, in plain and simple terms, it's not easy for Chinese money to leave China. It's also not easy for foreigners to flood in and buy Chinese assets. Now, is the whole system airtight? No. But for the most part, it works the way China wants it to work. And all of what I've explained here is really just in the service of one simple point, that if China wanted to manipulate its currency so that it could sell more stuff abroad, it could absolutely do that. So does it?
Today it was announced that China is reducing its currency. Did you see that? Big. They got every trick on the book.
Trump has a tendency to put things in very stark terms. Everything is black and white. But on whether China is a currency manipulator, you have to answer this question in degrees, and I can show you why. This is a chart of how many yuan or renminbi it has taken to purchase $1 US every year for the last 35 years. And because we're talking about exchange rates, just keep in mind that the higher the line goes, the less valuable China's currency is getting. So this is a gauge of currency weakness. But the first thing to notice is all the right angles. I mean, this is not what a natural market forces trajectory for anything looks like, right? And let's focus in on this 10-year period, starting in 1994. China's currency weakens dramatically, instantly losing about a third of its value against the US dollar. Then, for a solid decade, the yuan's value holds almost perfectly steady, keeping the yuan undervalued, much to the benefit of China's export sector.
I think it's probably true to say during the 90s and 2000s that China was seeking to keep the exchange rate suppressed. They were using a cheap renminbi as a source of promoting export-based growth.
And about halfway through Trump's first term, see this spike in the exchange rate? Remembering that the higher the line, the weaker the renminbi?
Back in 2018, after the Trump administration imposed tariffs on imports from China, the renminbi weakened from about 6.3 to the dollar to over 7 to the dollar. So it was a kind of meaningful depreciation of the Chinese exchange rate. And that meaningful depreciation of the Chinese exchange rate was the sort of the basis on which in 2019, the Trump administration labeled China as a currency manipulator.
Massive market barriers, heavy state subsidies, currency manipulation.
But even this still ignores most of the last 20 years, as China's currency has actually strengthened in value relative to the US dollar, making its exports more expensive, not less. And the tight leash China keeps on its money to begin with, all those, capital controls that we talked about, that doesn't make the yuan less valuable. It makes it more valuable.
There's more Chinese money that wants to get out of China than the rest of the world money wants to come into China. If China got rid of its capital controls today, the demand for dollars would spike, and so the exchange rate would weaken. So to say that a country that has capital controls, that country is manipulating its currency too weak, at some level doesn't make sense.
China has at times tried to keep the renminbi from getting weaker, but there are very few instances over the past 3 years when China has acted in the market to try to keep the renminbi from strengthening. The basic direction of pressure has been towards a weaker renminbi despite China's trade surplus, and the best evidence suggests that China has been resisting that. So China doesn't currently fit the pattern that would generally be associated with a finding of manipulation.
But twice a year, the US Treasury Department still publishes an analysis of countries it suspects of currency manipulation. Right now, there are 7 countries on a so-called monitoring list, and China is one of them. But it's also true that trying to evaluate what the heck China is doing on anything at any given moment, this is hard when it veils so much of its operations in secrecy. The US points directly to China's failure to publish foreign exchange intervention and broader lack of transparency around key features of its exchange rate mechanism.
If manipulation means intervening, managing, China is always intervening and always managing.
When you have a fixed exchange rate, by definition, you're manipulating your currency. The question is whether or not that fixed exchange rate undervalues or overvalues your currency.
No other country, to my knowledge, has a framework like the US framework for labeling countries as currency manipulators. No other country really cares in the same way that the United States does.
It's no secret that the Trump administration sees China as the single biggest threat to US dominance. The US and China are the #1 and #2 largest economies in the world. And Germany at #3 isn't even close. So when Trump accuses China of cheating, it's certainly a possibility. But just the fact of making the accusation, as often as Trump does, accomplishes a political goal, whether what he says is true or not.